Hi, I'm Caki Wilkinson. I'm a doctoral candidate in the Department of English and Comparative Literature here at UC, and I'm going to interview Don Bogen today. Don is the Nathaniel H Professor of English and Comparative Literature. He's a poet and a translator as well, and he is a pretty great mentor for doctoral students like myself.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Starting, I guess, with the title of the book. The algebra, it seems to me, in the book provides an organizing strategy of sorts that allows you to give the book some shape and structure. And I was curious, was this something that came to you at the beginning of when you started writing this book, or was it something that came to you during the process of the writing?
The title actually came fairly early, but the whole book began, I thought I was writing a single long poem made up of small units. And the long poem was supposed to be about change and metamorphoses. And then I eventually broke it into a series of sequences and then began arranging them with these small units. And what intrigued me about algebra, though the book is very balanced, and it has nothing to do, the book doesn't have much to do with math,
right,
but it was the origins of the word. It's one of the few words in English that has an Arabic origin. Algebra, which means the bringing together of broken parts. And so when I was working on the sequence that eventually became an algebra, that was always the closing part of that sequence, was to actually state that idea of the bringing together of broken parts, and how that, in that lovely sense of balance, and that, the trick is that nothing's lost, but in real life things are lost. So it's a book that kind of looks at that question of balance. It's not actually, it is very balanced and framed, and 4 sequences on the first part, 4 sequences on the second, like an algebraic equation. But algebra 2 is as far as I got, so it's not, I'm an English major, that's how it came about. Yeah, so it came later, and the interest was etymological, I think, more than mathematical.
One of the really interesting and I think impressive things about this book for me is the way that the structure is in many ways mimetic of the subject matter, and you talked about broken parts and pulling things together and things like that. And I'm thinking about so many of the poems in the book seem to be related to memory and the limitations of memory, and just the speaker sort of wrestling with, on the one hand, kind of wanting to recover the past, and then on the other hand, maybe wanting to leave the past behind. I'm thinking of the poem that opens the book, which is called Run, and you have this jogger who's running, it almost seems away from something in some ways, and the poem opens, wanted solitude, feared it. So I'm curious about these kind of different pulls of memory in the book, the way that that's working. Could you talk a little bit about that, about memory, the way that it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's very much, I think, it's probably the most intimate thing I've done, in the sense it's very, very personal, and it does kind of the nature of a kind of middle-aged project, I guess you could say. But I think you put your finger on it. There is a kind of and something that evolved in the course of it. Not something I was intentionally thinking about, but probably because I was working in these very short units for the most part. They lend themselves to little bits of time that you remember, and then thematic elements related to that come through and get explored. And I think one of them very much is, and it comes out in that poem Run, which is in some ways a description of runs I take around here, and but the overlay is the desire to get away and to be in kind of the stream of time and involved with things. And then also there's something that just came up in the writing of that poem, was the sense of imagining other lives and other lives, and then wanting those things to, in a way, to be kind of free and not bound by time.
Right.
But then
things that you didn't recognize. I remember that from the poem. One of the things I didn't, that were unfamiliar or something.
Yeah, and of course with any kind of run, you usually have to loop back, and that's kind of depressing and stuff. And I think there's a lot of wrestling with that. That and the the sense that when you write those things down, then they're no longer the thing. You know, that frustrate. I mean, I love. That's what I write. You know, I mean, it's you're making these beautiful structures. Hope beautiful or interesting structures out of words. Right. But the moment that you make them into an object, then they know they're not the memory. And it's something I feel like I've been concerned with ever since I began writing, is partly this feeling like, because I have these, you know, everybody has these experiences, and every once in a while says, that should be a poem. Right. And I can't, you know, the muse doesn't speak to me that way, and so these things come up, little memory things, and then if they do get turned into a poem, and there's a poem about, you know, when our kids were young, and all kinds of things, and they're made into poems, but they're not really the memory, you know, they're just an artifact, and that sense of I want to make things, and they make artifacts, but the artifacts don't capture the reality, and even the construction of an eye is an obviously kind of clearly artificial thing.
Well, I want to change gears and talk, because you're not just a poet. You're also a teacher, you know, a translator, a critic. And I wanted to talk a little bit about translation, because I know that's something that's been important. And especially recently, you've been translating the Spanish poet Julio Martinez Nasanza.
Yeah, very good, very good. Yeah, well, that came about. I had done some translation. I've always done translation on and off, and the project with Julio's work came about. I had the Fulbright to teach American literature in Spain, up in the northwest corner, and at two different universities, and it was just wonderful. But when I was there, I was, you know, improving my Spanish. And I thought, well, you know, here I know, you know, Machado and Garcia Lorca and the early 20th century figures somewhat, and I can read the language. At least I could after I was there for a while. And I thought, well, I don't know anything about contemporary poetry, so I started reading anthologies of living Spanish poets, and I came across this guy's work, and he is a very distinctive, interesting poet who writes in a fairly strict form, who writes a lot about history, particularly things like medieval warfare, and he just intrigued me because he was so different from all these other poets. So I began to work on that, and then I emailed him and asked for his permission, and he's been very kind. So that was a number of years ago now, and I, you know, more or less finished with a body of his selected poems.
I was going to ask if that's what is the ultimate goal, to put out a book, you know, a translation of his poetry, or are you just? I know that some of these poems have been published.
Yeah, a good number now. I have I'm doing a selected poems of him. I still have to write the introduction, but I made the selection, and it's, you know, let's see, it's about 45 poems or so.
Well, we're getting here towards the end of the interview, but I thought maybe it would be a nice note to end on if you could just talk a little bit about being at UC. You've been here for more than 30 years.
No,
so
it's not possible. Well, I've been thinking about it because, you know, I've been doing readings and going around, and people ask about the place a lot of the time, and it seems to me that I think what keeps me here now, especially, is a sense of community. You know, that the community of, you know, I'll just talk mostly about poetry, but the community of graduate students. These guys are terrific, you know, and people are actively publishing, and they're sharing work with each other, and there are people like you who are publishing books while they're in graduate school, people entering the program sometimes with books, but also people who are terrific poets who, you know, who don't have books, and they're also engaged. And then the poets and the faculty members, you know, hang out a lot. I mean, I went to a large school, and I remember readings there where, you know, you'd have like the assistant professor who would introduce the associate professor who would introduce the full professor, and then the poet would come on stage, you know, surrounded by, you know. And, you know, we have the Olson Room, and people come and read in small groups, and people go out to a local tavern afterwards, and that sense of community is just wonderful. And then I think the program, not just the graduate program, but the university in general, having been here all these years, it seems like it gets better and better. And at kind of key places in my career, you know, things have personally gotten better for me.
Well, thank you, Don. I appreciate you answering these questions today.
Yeah, well, thanks for the questions. They were smart, and I really enjoyed it.